In 1546, an Italian physician published a book that convinced millions of Europeans to stop bathing. The book claimed that hot water was a killer. It said that steam and warm liquid opened hidden doorways in human skin, and through those doorways, death itself could enter the body. The physician was Girolamo Fracastoro, and his treatise, De Contagione, didn't just describe a theory. It codified a fear that would grip Europe for 3 more centuries. The fear was called miasma. Fracastoro argued that disease was not passed from person to person through touch or fluids. It drifted through the air like smoke, invisible and everywhere, a corruption in the atmosphere itself. Physicians called these corrupt vapors miasmata. And according to the medical establishment, the human skin was their primary entry point. The logic was ancient, tracing back to the Greek physician Galen more than 1,000 years earlier. Galen had taught that the body was governed by 4 humors and that the skin contained millions of invisible pores. These pores were not sealed. They were gateways that opened and closed in response to temperature. Cold water tightened them, locking contaminants out. Hot water and steam relaxed them, swinging the gates wide open. Into those open gates, miasmata could pour. The danger was not theoretical. It had been demonstrated on a scale that haunted the entire continent. 2 centuries before Fracastoro put his arguments down on paper, the Black Death had walked across Europe. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire European population. Entire villages emptied out. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. And in the midst of that catastrophe, the most respected medical authority in Europe made a pronouncement. The Faculty of Medicine of Paris, the intellectual center of medieval medicine, issued an official advisory. They told the public to stop bathing. The faculty's reasoning was precise and terrifying. Warm water softened the body's tissues and opened the pores. In a world saturated with plague-carrying air, a bath was essentially an invitation. You were opening thousands of microscopic doors and asking the disease to walk through. The public listened. Public bathhouses had been common across medieval Europe for centuries. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne had dozens of them. They were social hubs where people gathered, ate, conducted business, and sometimes engaged in activities that had nothing to do with hygiene. The English called them stews. The Southwark stews across the Thames from London were famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked. By the late 14th century, municipal authorities began shutting them down. The closures were not immediate or universal. They happened in waves, each new outbreak of plague prompting another round of shutdowns. But the direction of travel was unmistakable. Bathing was being reclassified from a social norm into a medical hazard. Fracastoro's 1546 treatise put a scientific seal on a fear that had been building for 2 centuries. He synthesized the observations of plague doctors, the theories of Galen, and the anxieties of a traumatized continent into a single coherent medical argument. And his argument arrived at exactly the moment when another disease was amplifying the panic. Syphilis had erupted across Europe in the late 15th century, brought back from the New World by returning sailors. It spread fast, it was disfiguring, and it was terrifying. Physicians noticed something that seemed to confirm everything they feared about public baths. The same bathhouses that had been associated with plague were also associated with the spread of syphilis. The medical establishment drew a conclusion that made sense within the framework of miasma theory. Bathwater itself was the vector. The warm water opened the pores, the steam carried the corrupt vapors, and the shared tubs allowed the disease to transfer from one body to another. The conclusion was wrong in its specifics, but practical in its result. The shared water in public baths did facilitate transmission, just not through miasma. In 1538, King Francis I of France took formal action. He issued a royal decree ordering the closure of all public bathhouses in Paris. The stated purpose was to curb the spread of syphilis. The unstated effect was to remove one of the last remaining institutions where ordinary people had access to hot water and soap. The closures were not limited to Paris. Across Europe, municipal bathhouses locked their doors. Some were converted into private residences or workshops. Others were simply abandoned and left to decay. The infrastructure of public bathing, which had been a feature of European urban life since the Roman Empire, effectively collapsed. And what replaced it was something stranger. If bathing was deadly, then staying dirty became a form of self-defense. The logic was this: if the pores were the entry point for disease, then the best way to protect them was to seal them shut. A layer of dirt and oil on the skin acted as a natural barrier against miasmata. Washing that layer away was not just unnecessary, it was reckless. The aristocracy adopted this principle with particular enthusiasm. At the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled France from 1643 to 1715, full-body bathing was practically non-existent. Louis himself was known to wash his face and hands with a cloth dipped in alcohol or perfume. That was considered sufficient. His palace at Versailles, for all its gilded rooms and mirrored halls, contained almost no bathrooms. The hundreds of courtiers who lived there managed their hygiene through a system of dry cleaning that had nothing to do with water. They changed their linen undergarments constantly. This was not a poor substitute for bathing in their view. It was a superior method altogether. The reasoning was rooted in the same miasma theory. Linen was believed to absorb sweat and draw impurities out of the skin. A clean white shirt or shift acted like a sponge, pulling the body's corrupt humors away from the pores before they could attract miasmata from the air. The more frequently you changed your linen, the cleaner you were considered to be. And because linen was expensive to produce and maintain, the visibility of clean undergarments became a marker of immense wealth. The portraits of the era tell the story. Anthony van Dyck, the Flemish painter who became the principal court artist to King Charles I of England, painted aristocrats whose status was broadcast in the brilliant white of their collars and cuffs. That white was not accidental. It signaled that the wearer had enough linen, enough servants, and enough money to change their undergarments multiple times a day. A peasant might own 1 or 2 shirts. A courtier might change 3 times before dinner. The gap between them was not just economic, it was hygienic, in a world where hygiene had been turned upside down. The scholars reinforced what the aristocrats practiced. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great humanist thinker, wrote about the matter in 1526. His book, De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, was a guide to manners and conduct for children. In it, Erasmus endorsed the washing of hands and face. Those were the visible parts of the body, the parts that others could see. But he warned against full-body immersion, which he considered dangerous. The advice was measured and specific. Wash what shows, protect what doesn't. The book was widely read and influential across Europe for generations. 2.5 centuries later, the medical literature had barely shifted. Dr. William Buchan published Domestic Medicine in 1769. It was one of the most popular health manuals of the 18th century, a book found in households across England and Scotland. Buchan did not advocate for bathing. He cautioned against it. Frequent immersion, he wrote, could weaken the body's natural constitution. It could open the system to colds, fevers, and respiratory ailments. The specific warning echoed Fracastori's from 2 centuries earlier. Water was not a cleanser, it was a threat. The book's success indicated how deeply these beliefs had settled into the culture. By the end of the 18th century, bathing was an act that almost no European performed regularly. The wealthy dabbed themselves with perfumed cloths and changed their shirts. The poor did what they could with cold water and rags, or did nothing at all. The bathhouses were gone. The doors were bolted, the tubs were dry, and the steam that had filled the stews of Southwark and the bath halls of Paris had dissipated into memory. A European living in the year 1600 who wanted to submerge their body in water faced a problem. The medical establishment had declared it a form of suicide. The church had associated communal bathing with sin and disease, and the law, in France and across much of the continent, had made the public bath a crime. So the human body, which still produced sweat and oil and odor, had to be managed some other way. The solution that emerged was not a new invention. It was a piece of fabric. Linen. Long before the bathhouses closed, Europeans wore linen undergarments against their skin. Shifts for women, shirts for men, made from the fibers of the flax plant, bleached pale and worn beneath layers of wool and silk and velvet. The fabric was absorbent, lightweight, and washable. And in the absence of bathing, its role expanded. Linen stopped being simply an undergarment. It became the primary tool of hygiene. The theory was straightforward. A clean linen shirt, pressed against the skin, would soak up sweat and draw out the body's impurities. The dirt and oil and moisture that a bath might have removed were instead absorbed by the fabric. Change the shirt, and you changed your cleanliness. The body itself did not need to touch water at all. This was not folk wisdom passed quietly between households. It was a formal medical doctrine, endorsed and published by the leading scholars of the age. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the Dutch humanist whose writings shaped the manners of the European elite, addressed the question directly in 1526. His book, De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, was a manual for the civilized life, a guide to conduct for young boys of noble birth. Erasmus endorsed hand-washing without hesitation. The hands, he wrote, should be cleaned before meals and after, using water and a cloth. But full-body immersion was another matter entirely. Erasmus warned against it. The submersion of the body in water, he explained, opened the pores to dangerous airs and invited illness. His reasoning aligned perfectly with the miasma theory that Fracastoro would formalize 2 decades later. The skin was a barrier. Hot water compromised that barrier. A person who bathed was a person who had voluntarily disarmed themselves against the invisible poisons in the air. Erasmus was not a physician. He was a philosopher, a theologian, a scholar of language and scripture. But his word carried immense weight. His book was translated, reprinted, and read in courts and households across the continent. When Erasmus said that bathing was dangerous, the educated class listened, and so the linen shirt became the mark of the civilized person. A wealthy man in the 17th century began his day by pulling a fresh linen shirt over his head. The fabric, bleached white and pressed smooth, served as a visible declaration. Look at my cuffs, look at my collar. I am clean, I am protected. I have not risked my life in a bath. The logic ran deeper than vanity. Clean linen was genuinely expensive to maintain. The washing process required large quantities of water, soap made from animal fat and lye, and hours of labor by servants or laundresses. A single shirt might be washed, bleached in the sun, and pressed over the course of several days. Owning enough linen to change daily required significant wealth. Owning linen fine enough to drape elegantly at the wrist and throat required even more. The fabric itself, its whiteness and its quality, broadcasted a person's position in the social order. This is visible in the art of the era. The Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck spent much of his career in England, serving as the principal court painter to King Charles I. His portraits of aristocrats and royals from the 1630s show the linen aesthetic in precise detail. The subjects wear lace-trimmed collars that spread across their shoulders like starched clouds. Their cuffs spill from the ends of velvet sleeves, crisp and white, and impossibly delicate. The faces are composed. The hands are pale. The linen is immaculate. A viewer in the 17th century understood the message instantly. These people did not bathe. They changed their shirts, and that was better. The medical establishment reinforced the practice at every turn. In 1769, a Scottish physician named Dr. William Buchan published a book titled Domestic Medicine. It was a manual intended for families, offering guidance on the treatment of common illnesses and the maintenance of general health. It was not a fringe pamphlet. Domestic medicine became one of the most widely read health texts in the English-speaking world. It went through multiple editions, sold tens of thousands of copies, and sat on shelves in homes across Britain and the American colonies. Buchan addressed bathing directly. He was cautious about it, wary of the dangers that his profession had warned against for centuries. Frequent bathing, he wrote, could weaken the constitution. The body's strength, its resistance to disease, could be compromised by too much contact with water. He did not condemn bathing outright, but his caution echoed the warnings of Erasmus and Fracastoro and the Faculty of Medicine of Paris. A sensible person bathed rarely, briefly, and with care. The message, repeated by physicians and philosophers and portrait painters for more than 200 years, had become embedded in the culture. Water was a threat. Linen was a shield. And nowhere was this logic pursued more thoroughly than at the court of Louis XIV. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France from 1643 to 1715. His reign was the longest in European history, and his court at the Palace of Versailles was the most scrutinized social environment on the continent. Thousands of aristocrats lived in the palace, competing for status, for favor, for the king's attention. Every detail of their appearance and conduct was observed and judged. Bathing was not among the observed details, because bathing did not happen. The king himself, by the standards of any other era in human history, almost never washed. His morning routine involved a brief washing of the hands and face. Servants would present a cloth dampened with alcohol or perfumed water. The king would wipe his hands. He would dab his face. His body, beneath layers of silk and velvet and linen, remained untouched by water. The court followed his example. Aristocrats at Versailles washed their visible skin, the hands and the face, and left the rest alone. Perfume filled the gap that water left behind. Heavy, alcohol-based fragrances were applied to the skin and clothing, masking odor, and, according to the beliefs of the time, helping to ward off disease. The alcohol in the perfume was thought to strengthen the skin's resistance to miasma, a chemical barrier against an invisible enemy. A person at Versailles in the year 1700 smelled not of soap and water. They smelled of jasmine, of musk, of clove, and bergamot. The scent was strong enough to announce their presence across a room. It was not a substitute for cleanliness. It was cleanliness as far as the medical knowledge of the era understood the word. And beneath the perfume, on skin that had not been submerged in water for months or years, a physical layer accumulated. The belief, stated openly by physicians and accepted by the elite, was that this layer of dirt and oil performed a protective function. It sealed the pores against the entry of poisoned air. Washing it away was not merely unnecessary, it was dangerous. A clean body, stripped of its natural defenses, was a vulnerable body. The logic was medically flawed, but it was internally consistent. Every piece of it fit together. The physicians warned that water opened pores. The evidence of plague and disease seemed to confirm that bathing was a risk. Linen provided a visible, status-enhancing alternative. Perfume sanitized what linen could not reach, and the accumulated grime of months or years became, in the mind of the era, a kind of armor. A person born into the European elite in the year 1600 could live their entire life without once submerging their body in water. They could marry, raise children, attend court, and die of old age, and their skin would never have felt the weight of a bath. They would have been considered clean. They would have considered themselves clean. Their linen was white. Their perfume was expensive. Their physicians approved. The reality was that the human body continued to function the way human bodies always had. Sweat glands produced sweat. Sebaceous glands produced oil. Skin cells died and sloughed off, accumulating in the folds of fabric, mixing with the residues of perfume and the fibers of linen. Parasites found a warm, undisturbed environment in the seams of clothing and the hair of the body. Lice and fleas were not a sign of poverty at Versailles. They were a fact of life for everyone, including the king. The courtiers adapted. Louse catching became a minor social ritual. Specialized tools, small combs and picks of ivory or bone, were used to remove parasites from wigs and collars. The presence of lice was not considered a failure of hygiene because the concept of hygiene had been redefined. Hygiene meant clean linen, clean hands, and a clean face. It did not mean clean skin. The distance between what the eye could see and what the microscope would later reveal was vast. No one at Versailles could see the bacteria on their skin or the microbial life multiplying in the warm, dark spaces beneath their clothing. They could only see what their culture had taught them to see. White cuffs, clear hands, the shine of silk. And so they believed they were safe. The poor, meanwhile, had none of these defenses. They could not afford the dozens of linen shirts required to maintain the dry hygiene ideal. They could not afford the perfumes that masked the body's accumulated odor. They owned perhaps one shirt, washed infrequently or not at all. Their skin was exposed to the same air and the same miasma as the skin of the aristocrats. By the medical logic of the era, they should have been the first to die, but they lived, often in squalor, and often they lived long enough to work and raise children and grow old. The paradox was visible to anyone who looked, but the theory had an answer. The poor were constitutionally different. Their bodies were hardened by labor and privation. What killed a refined aristocrat might leave a peasant unharmed, not because the theory was wrong, but because the bodies were different. This was not evidence against miasma. It was evidence of the complexity of miasma. The theory bent to absorb every contradiction. The dry hygiene era lasted, in its purest form, for roughly 300 years. From the closing of the bathhouses in the 16th century to the first stirrings of the sanitary movement in the early 19th, the European elite lived by the rules that Erasmus had articulated and that Buchan had reinforced. Change your linen, wash your hands, perfume your body, and do not, under any circumstances, submerge yourself in a bath. The cost of this system, measured in human terms, is difficult to calculate. Skin infections went untreated because the skin was not examined. Parasites multiplied in the warm folds of fabric and flesh. Wounds that might have been cleaned with water were wrapped in linen and left to fester. The absence of bathing did not cause the great epidemics of the era. Plague and cholera and smallpox would have devastated Europe regardless of how often people washed. But the dry hygiene system made certain conditions worse, and it prevented almost no one from getting sick. The linen shirt absorbed sweat, but it did not absorb disease. The perfume masked odor, but it did not mask infection. And the accumulated layer of dirt and oil, which the physicians had declared protective, served only to trap the body's own waste against the skin for weeks and months and years. The portrait that Anthony van Dyck painted of an English aristocrat in 1635 is beautiful. The lace is luminous. The hand resting on the velvet doublet is pale and graceful. The subject looks out at the viewer with an expression of calm self-possession. What the painting does not show is the skin beneath the linen, the parasites in the seams of the collar, the months of accumulated oil and dead cells on the legs and torso. The painting was not a lie. It was a record of what the era valued: clean linen, composed features, visible status. The body itself was a private matter, hidden and ignored, and left to manage itself as best it could. The fact that this system persisted for 3 centuries is a testament to the power of authority. A physician said that bathing opened the pores. A scholar said that submersion invited illness. A king declined to bathe, and his court declined with him. Millions of people followed their example, not because they were ignorant or foolish, but because they trusted the experts their culture had given them. The experts were wrong, but the wrongness was invisible, locked inside a material reality that no one had the tools to see. The bacteria that caused infection, the viruses that spread through droplets and contact, the parasites that completed their life cycles in human hair and human skin. None of it was visible to the naked eye, and so the linen shirt remained the standard of cleanliness until the standard itself collapsed under the weight of evidence. The collapse began, slowly and against fierce resistance, in the middle of the 19th century. The work of John Snow and Ignaz Semmelweis and Edwin Chadwick did not directly address the bathing question. Snow was concerned with water pumps. Semmelweis was concerned with hand washing. Chadwick was concerned with sewers. But the world they built, the sanitary infrastructure and the germ theory that justified it, made the dry hygiene system impossible to sustain. A person who understood that cholera traveled through contaminated water could look at a bathtub and see not a portal for miasma, but a tool for removing filth. A person who understood that physicians' hands carried infection from cadavers to mothers could look at their own unwashed body and draw uncomfortable conclusions. The logic reversed itself. Water, once feared as the carrier of disease, became the means of its prevention. The bath, once closed by law and condemned by medicine, reopened as an instrument of public health. The centuries of dry hygiene ended not with a single discovery, but with a slow, grinding shift in the foundation of knowledge. The pores that Fracastoro had warned about in 1546 were the same pores that a person in 1854 learned to scrub with soap and hot water. The skin had not changed. The water had not changed. Only the story told about them had changed, and that story had been wrong for 300 years. The collapse began in a maternity ward in Vienna. The year was 1847, and the Vienna General Hospital housed 2 obstetric clinics. One was staffed by physicians and medical students. The other was staffed by midwives. The difference in mortality rates between the two clinics was a horror that no one could explain. In the physician's clinic, the death rate from puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, ranged between 10 and 20%. In some months it climbed higher, past 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 mothers who gave birth there died. The midwives' clinic, by contrast, lost between 2 and 3% of its mothers. The women of Vienna knew the numbers. They begged on their knees outside the hospital gates to be sent to the midwives' ward. Some women chose to give birth in the street rather than enter the physician's clinic. The physicians themselves had no answer. Puerperal fever was understood to be an atmospheric condition, a miasma that settled on certain wards and certain patients for reasons that medical science could not identify. The higher death rate in the physician's clinic was attributed to the stress of being examined by male doctors, to the rough handling of students, to the bad air that accumulated in crowded teaching rooms. One physician looked at the discrepancy and refused to accept the existing explanations. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian-born assistant in the first obstetrical clinic. Semmelweis was not a theorist. He was a methodical observer, and what he observed was a pattern that the miasma theory could not explain. The difference was that Lister's audience was ready to hear it. The germ theory did not instantly convert the medical profession. Debates continued for decades. But the weight of evidence became overwhelming. By the 1890s, the miasma theory that had governed European medicine for 2,000 years was dead. The pores that Fracastoro had warned about in 1546 were no longer feared as portals for disease. The hot water that the Faculty of Medicine of Paris had condemned during the Black Death was no longer suspected of softening the body to plague. The bath, which for 3 centuries had been a medical sin, became a medical prescription. Public bathhouses reopened across Europe, this time not as places of leisure, but as instruments of public health. In Germany, the Prussian government built public baths for the urban poor, beginning in the 1880s. In Britain, the Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846 had already authorized local authorities to build facilities for bathing and laundry, though construction accelerated after the germ theory gained acceptance. By the early 20th century, the routine of regular bathing with soap and hot water was established among the middle and upper classes. The working classes gained access more slowly, limited by the slow construction of municipal facilities and the cost of soap, but the trajectory was set. The body that had been hidden under layers of linen and perfume was uncovered and scrubbed. The skin that had been allowed to accumulate months of oil and dead cells was examined and cleaned. The parasites that had lived in the seams of collars and cuffs lost their habitat. The 300-year experiment in dry hygiene was over.